Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we ride out across a sea of grass so wide and so old that the wind has been combing it since before history bothered to write anything down. You feel it first on your skin, that endless steppe air, dry and cold and smelling faintly of horses and wood smoke. Above you the sky is a blue so deep it almost hums. The kind of sky the people here will one day call eternal. The kind they will swear watches over them. You are standing somewhere in the heart of Mongolia, roughly 8 centuries ago, and somewhere nearby a boy is being born who will frighten half the planet. Fair warning though, out here the winters can freeze a grown man solid overnight. The rival clans would happily leave you for the wolves. And you, soft creature of central heating and grocery delivery, probably won't survive this. But you don't have to. You only have to watch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what the local time is, because I love imagining all of you scattered across your own little corners of the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The boy is named Temüjin, and the story goes that he is born clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, an omen the old women murmur of a life soaked in conquest. Historians still argue whether that detail is true or just the kind of thing people invent after a man becomes terrifying, but it sets the tone beautifully, doesn't it? His father is Yasuge, a chieftain of modest standing, a man of the Borjigin clan, who hunts and raids and bargains like everyone else on this hard ground. You watch Yasuge lift the boy and you can almost feel the pride radiating off him, the certainty that this son will carry the family forward. That certainty does not last. When Temüjin is still a child, 9 years old by most tellings, his father takes him on a long ride to arrange a marriage, as fathers do here, securing alliances the way you'd lock a door. They find a girl named Berta, and the match is made, and Temüjin is left with her family to grow into the role of husband. You'd think that's a tender beginning. But on the ride home alone, Yasuge stops at the camp of some Tatars, accepts their hospitality and drinks. The Tatars remember old grudges the way the steppe remembers winter, patiently, completely. They poison him. He makes it home only long enough to die. And here is where the world turns cruel. With Yasuge gone, his clan does the math. A widow and her small children are mouths to feed, not assets to protect. So they simply leave. You watch the whole encampment pack up and ride away, abandoning Temüjin's mother, the fierce and unforgettable Holun, with her young brood on the open plain. It is frankly a death sentence, delivered by shrug. There's a famous image of Holun raising the clan banner and trying to shame the deserters into staying galloping after them, and it nearly works, but pride and hunger win, and the family is left to fend entirely for itself. What follows are the years that forge the man. You see them digging for roots, catching fish and marmots, scraping survival out of ground that gives nothing freely. Imagine it, the future ruler of the largest land empire in human history, as a boy picking wild onions to keep his siblings alive. There's something almost funny about it in hindsight. The way the universe hides its biggest plot twists inside the most miserable little campsites. But the steppe is not done testing him. Temüjin has a half-brother named Begta, older, throwing his weight around, hoarding food the starving family cannot spare. And one day, Temüjin, together with his younger brother Kasa, settles the matter the hard way. We won't dwell on it, these were brutal times and survival made terrible choices ordinary, but the boy who pulls a bow on his own kin is no longer entirely a boy. Holun, the story says, is horrified and rages at him about what he's become. You can feel the chill of it, a mother realizing her son has learned the steppe's lesson too well. Then comes the capture. A rival clan, the Taichi-ud, the very people who abandoned him, seize Temüjin and clamp a heavy wooden collar around his neck, a kangu, the kind that pins your arms and keeps you helpless and humiliated. You can almost feel the weight of it, the splinters, the ache. He's paraded as a prisoner, a nobody's son with delusions above his station. And yet here the legend sparkles again, because Temüjin escapes, slips his guards during a feast, hides in a river with only his nose above the cold water, and is secretly helped by a sympathetic family who could have turned him in for a brace, reward, and chose mercy instead. Historians still argue whether the details are embroidered, but the bones of it hold betrayal, captivity, and a will that simply refused to break. And as the light fades now on this hungry, frost-bitten boyhood, let the harshness of it all begin to soften. The cold steppe wind is dying down to a whisper, the long grass is bending low and going still the way a tired crowd finally quiets. That little family on the plain, so frightened, so alone, survived their winters and slept beneath the same eternal sky that has long since gone dark and peaceful. The hunger is over now, the fear is folded away, the river that hid a frightened boy runs slow and silent in the night. All of it, the betrayal, the collar, the loss, has settled gently into the deep, soft earth of long ago, where nothing can hurt any more. You are safe in your bed, far from that ancient grass, and the world around you is quiet and warm and still. Rest now. There is so much more to come, but it can wait until you wake. You watch him grow into his shoulders, that hungry boy from the riverbank, and the steppe around him has not changed. It is still a churning mess of clans that raid and marry and betray one another in dizzying rotation. Out here, loyalty is a currency more precious than gold, and you'll see that Temüjin understands this earlier and better than anyone alive. He reclaims his bride Berta, the girl his father promised him, and her arrival comes with a gift that changes everything. A magnificent black sable cloak, part of her dowry. Now a poor man might wear such a thing to keep warm and feel briefly wonderful. Temüjin does something far cleverer. He gives it away. He carries that cloak to a powerful chieftain named Togrul, sometimes called the Ong Khan, a man who had once been a sworn brother and Anda to Temujin's dead father. By offering the cloak, Temüjin is essentially saying, I am your son now, protect me as you would your own. And it works. You feel the calculation humming beneath the courtesy. The way this young man with almost nothing turns a piece of fur into a political alliance. It's the kind of move that makes you realize empires aren't always built on swords. Sometimes they're built on really well-timed gifts. That alliance is tested almost immediately because Berta is stolen, carried off in a raid by the Merkit clan, who have an old grudge to settle. And here you watch Temüjin do the thing that will define him. He refuses to suffer the loss quietly. He calls in his favors. Togrul lends warriors, and so does another figure who matters enormously, a charismatic young man named Jamuka, Temüjin's childhood friend and blood brother. Together they ride down the Merkit and recover Berta. There's a tender, complicated detail here that historians still argue over. Berta returns pregnant, and whether her firstborn son Jochi was Temüjin's child by blood would shadow the family for generations. But in this moment you see only triumph. The wife reclaimed, the friendships proven, the young leader rising. And yet friendship on the steppe is a fragile, flammable thing. Temüjin and Jamuka, these two brothers who once shared everything, begin to drift. The split, the legend says, came over something almost absurdly small, a cryptic remark about where to make camp, whether by the mountain or by the river. But beneath it lay something larger. Jamuka represented the old way, the aristocracy of blood, where you followed a man because of who his ancestors were. Temüjin offered something radical: follow me because of what you can do, and I will reward you for loyalty, no matter how low your birth. You can imagine which message the ordinary herdsman, the abandoned, the overlooked, found more appealing. Slowly the tribes begin choosing sides. What follows are years of war, grinding back and forth, deeply personal war. You watch Temüjin lose battles, watch him scatter and regroup, watch him absorb defeated tribes, not by slaughtering them wholesale, but by folding their warriors into his own ranks and treating them as his people. This is the quiet genius of it. When he conquers a clan, he doesn't just take their herds. He takes their loyalty by giving the survivors a place. He breaks up the old tribal blocks and reorganizes his followers into military units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, deliberately mixing men from different clans, so their first loyalty becomes the unit, and above all, him. Historians still argue over exactly how revolutionary this was for its time, but the effect is undeniable. He is dissolving the ancient web of blood loyalty and reweaving it around a single name. There's a darker, stranger tale that clings to this period too. After finally defeating the Tatars, the very people who poisoned his father Temüjin is said to have ordered that the men taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel be done away with, sparing only the children who would be raised as Mongols. Whether that grim measurement was literal or a later flourish, scholars genuinely debate. But it captures the cold arithmetic of his rise, erase the old leadership, adopt the young, and the threat simply ceases to exist a generation later. And then comes the final reckoning with Jamuka. The old friend, the blood brother, is at last defeated and brought before him. The sources tell it tenderly and tragically. Temüjin, it's said, offered to renew their friendship, but Jamuka, perhaps too proud, perhaps too tired, asked instead for an honourable death, without the spilling of his blood, which on the steppe was a kind of dignity. Temüjin granted it. You feel the weight of that two boys who once swapped knucklebones and promises ending it this way under the wide and indifferent sky. By now there is no rival left standing. The Naimans, the Kerites, the Merkits, the Tatars, all absorbed, all broken, all gathered under one man. And so, in the year we'd call 1206, the chieftains assemble at a great council, a Kurultai beside the source of the Onon River. There, beneath that same eternal blue sky, you've felt since the very beginning. They raise him up and proclaim him not merely Khan of one tribe, but Genghis Khan, universal ruler, the great Khan of all who live in felt tents. The hungry boy who dug for roots is now the master of the steppe, and as that great gathering settles into feasting, and the firelight dims across the gathered tents, let yourself drift down with the evening. The shouting and the celebration soften now into a low and distant murmur, the horses dozing, the banners hanging quiet in the cooling air. All those rivalries, all that struggle and heartbreak, have long since folded themselves into the deep stillness of the past, where Jamuka sleeps and Berta sleeps, and even the great Khan himself sleeps, far beyond any reach of harm. The fire burns low, the sky turns black and tender, and you, warm and safe and far away, can let your eyes grow heavy. The steppe is quiet now. Rest. There is more to come, but it will keep until morning. So now there is one man over all the felt tent peoples, and the question that hangs in the cold morning air is simply this: what does a universal ruler do with a universe of warriors? You watch Genghis Khan answer that question by building something the world has never quite seen, not just an army, but a machine, a vast and breathing organism of horse and bone and discipline that will roll outward until it bumps against oceans. It begins with that structure he'd been refining for years, now made law. The whole nation is carved into units based on the number 10. 10 men form an arban, 10 of those 100, 10 hundreds, 1,000 and 10,000 together form the mighty Temüjin. Clean, simple, brutally effective. You can feel the logic of it. Every man knows exactly whose orders he follows and exactly who follows him, all the way up to the Khan himself. And because Genghis deliberately scrambled the old tribes into these new units, a man can no longer desert to rejoin his kin, because his kin are scattered across the whole army. His unit is his family now. His commander is his blood. Historians still argue over how much of this was pure invention versus the polishing of older steppe customs, but no one disputes that it worked terrifyingly well. Then there is the horse, and oh, you must understand the horse. The Mongol pony is a shaggy, stubborn, unglamorous little creature, the kind a knight on a towering European warhorse might smirk at right before that knight is run into the ground. These animals can forage for themselves under snow, endure cold that would kill finer breeds, and gallop for impossible distances. Each warrior keeps not one but a whole string of remounts, sometimes 4 or 5, switching to a fresh horse as the last tires. The arithmetic of that is staggering. While an enemy army crawls forward, tethered to slow supply wagons, the Mongols flow across the land like spilled water, covering in days what should take weeks. There's a quirky detail the sources love. A rider could nick a vein in his horse's neck and drink a little of its blood for sustenance on a hard ride, then seal it up and keep going. Whether that was routine or rare, scholars genuinely debate, but it tells you everything about how little this army needed to stop. And these riders are archers, that is the heart of it. From the time a Mongol child can sit upright, he is on horseback, and not long after he is shooting. You watch boys barely tall enough to hold a bow loosing arrows at small targets, learning to fire, not just forward, but backward over the horse's tail, the famous Parthian shot twisting in the saddle to sting a pursuing enemy. Their composite bows, built from layered wood and horn and sinew, are short enough to swing around in the saddle, yet powerful enough to punch through armor at a distance that leaves the enemy helpless, unable to strike back. Picture it from the receiving end, an enemy line bristling and ready for a charge that never comes, while clouds of arrows fall on them from riders who simply will not close the distance. But raw skill would mean nothing without the thing that truly set them apart: discipline and the silent language they used to wield it. On the open field, where a shout cannot carry over thundering hooves, the Mongols maneuvered entire formations using signals, flags and banners by day, flaming arrows and lanterns by night, and the deep boom of war drums to set them moving. Whole humans could wheel, feign retreat, split and reconverge as if they shared a single mind. That feigned retreat became their signature trick. You watch them break and flee in apparent panic, and you watch the enemy, drunk on the scent of victory, abandon their formation to chase straight into a closing trap where the fleeing riders suddenly turn and the hidden wings fold shut like to Yorf. It worked again and again across continents against peoples who surely should have learned. They never quite did. Behind all this stood a law, the Yassa, the code attributed to Genghis Khan himself. Its exact contents are lost to us, and historians still argue over what it truly contained, but its spirit endured in memory: ferocious punishment for cowardice, for theft from a comrade, for abandoning your unit in battle. If one man fled the line, his whole unit could pay. If one unit broke, when it should have held, the consequences rolled outward, so the men did not break. Loyalty wasn't merely encouraged, it was engineered into the bones of the thing, with terror and reward in perfect balance. And don't picture a disorganized horde, despite the word we've inherited. Picture instead a staff that planned. Before a campaign, scouts and merchants and spies fanned out to map roads, count enemy forces, learn which cities were rich and which were weak, which rival lord hated his neighbor and might be turned. The Khan gathered intelligence the way a careful gambler counts cards. He also prized the talents of the people he conquered: engineers who knew how to break a city's walls, scribes who could administer it afterward. A Mongol on the steppe had no idea how to besiege a stone fortress, so he simply acquired the people who did and pointed them at the next set of walls. That hunger to absorb skill rather than merely destroy it is part of what carried them so far. And as the great machine wheels and reforms across the practice fields, the drums fading now into the soft hush of evening, let your own thoughts begin to slow and settle. The banners droop, the horses are led to water, the children set down their little bows and drift toward the warmth of the tents. All that fearsome motion, all that thunder, has long since stilled into the deep quiet of centuries gone by, where the riders sleep beside their patient ponies under a sky gone soft and dark. You need not march, nor ride, nor stand the line tonight. You are warm and still and wonderfully far away, and the only sound left is the gentle hum that surrounds you. Let it carry you down. Rest now while the army sleeps. So you have the machine, the tens and hundreds and thousands, the shaggy ponies, the arrows that fall like weather. Now you watch Genghis Khan turn it south, towards something the steppe peoples had always regarded with a mixture of hunger and awe: China. But you must throw away the picture of one single China here, because in these years the land was divided. The kingdom of the Tangut people, and across the north sprawled the great Jin dynasty ruled by the Jurchen, a wealthy and powerful state that had long treated the steppe tribes as troublesome inferiors, to be managed, bribed and occasionally culled. The Jin had grown comfortable. That comfort was about to become a problem. Genghis warmed up, so to speak, on the western Shire first. The Tangut cities were a puzzle, because here the Mongols ran headlong into the thing they were worst at: walls. You watch them mill about beneath stone fortifications, baffled a people of the open plain confronting the patient stubbornness of masonry. At one city the Mongols even tried, in a fit of grim creativity, to divert a river to flood the place into surrender. The scheme backfired and ended up flooding their own camp instead, which is the kind of detail that reminds you these were brilliant, dangerous men who were still learning a brand new trade on the fly. But they learned, they forced the Western Seer to submit, to pay tribute, and crucially, to become a source of those very engineers and siege specialists the Mongols lacked. Then came the real prize. By around the year we'd call 1211, Genghis turned the full weight of his attention on the jinn. And here you feel the audacity of it, because the jinn could field armies that vastly outnumbered the Mongols. Hundreds of thousands of men, fortified cities, deep reserves of grain and gold. On paper it was no contest. On paper the Khan should have been crushed. But paper, as the jinn were about to discover, does not win wars. The Great Wall in this era was nothing like the continuous stone dragon you've seen in photographs. Much of that came centuries later. What stood here were older, more broken lines of fortification, garrisoned passes, defended gaps in the hills. And the Mongols got through partly by force and partly by something cheaper and more reliable defection. There were peoples living along the frontier, including the Khitan, who had once ruled the north themselves before the Jurchen overthrew them, and who nursed a long, cold grudge. When the Mongols came, many of these frontier groups simply opened the door. Historians still argue over how decisive these defections were, but the pattern is unmistakable. Genghis didn't just smash his way in. He found the cracks in his enemy's house and pried them wide. What follows are years of campaigning across the north, and you watch the Mongols do to the jinn what they did to everyone: outmaneuver, outride, and refuse to fight fair. They ranged across the countryside, defeating jinn armies in the open, where their horsemanship and feigned retreats turned numerical superiority into a liability. A huge army is only powerful if it can catch you, and nobody could catch the Mongols. They struck, withdrew, struck again, bled the great dynasty piece by piece while their own losses stayed light. Time and again the jinn sent out enormous forces to crush the nuisance once and for all, and time and again those forces marched home in tatters, if they marched home at all. Still the cities held for a while. The great jinn capital, Zhongdu, sitting where modern Beijing now stands, was a fortress of formidable walls, and the Mongols laid siege to it. You can imagine the long, hungry months, the defenders watching the horsemen circle, the slow grind of starvation and despair settling over the trapped population. Eventually the city fell, and the sources describe a sack so thorough that travellers passing the site long afterward spoke of it in hushed and mournful tones. The kind of devastation history records but politely declines to detail. We'll leave it there in the soft shadows where such sorrows belong. The point you must take is the shock of it. One of the richest cities in the world brought down by a people who, a single generation earlier, had been digging roots out of frozen ground. There's a quieter thread woven through all this conquest, and it matters enormously for what's to come. Genghis began to gather not just plunder but talent. A captured Khitan nobleman and scholar named Yelu Chukai entered his service and would become one of the most important administrators in the empire, a man who is said to have argued with great patience that you cannot tax a population you have entirely wiped out, that living productive subjects are worth more than empty grassland. Whether the Khan fully embraced that wisdom or merely tolerated it, scholars genuinely debate, but the very presence of such a counselor signals something. The destroyer was beginning slowly to think about how to rule. The jinn were not finished off in these years. They staggered on wounded, and shrinking their capital lost their confidence, shattered their final destruction, left for the next generation to complete. But the spell was broken. The mighty had been humbled by the nomads they once despised, and word of it rippled outward across the whole of Asia. And as the dust of those broken northern plains settles slowly in the failing light, let the noise of it recede from you now. The siege engines fall silent, the great walls stand quiet in the gathering dark, and the long columns of riders fade like smoke into the folds of the past. All that striving, all that loss has long since come to rest beneath the patient earth, where the proud and the conquered sleep side by side and trouble no one anymore. You are not on those cold plains. You are here wrapped warm and safe, with nothing to fear and nowhere you must be. The world has gone soft and dim around you. Let it. Close your eyes and drift while the old kingdoms sleep. Now turn your gaze west, far from the broken plains of the jinn, to a glittering and powerful realm you may never have heard of, the Khwarezmian Empire. It sprawled across what we'd now call Iran, much of Central Asia, and beyond a young, ambitious state ruled by a man called Shah Muhammad II, who governed wealthy cities whose names ring like poetry. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Herat. Here was a land of domes and gardens and caravan markets of scholars and silk and astonishing riches. And here too was a ruler with a swollen sense of his own importance, which, as you're about to see, is just about the most dangerous thing a neighbor of Genghis Khan could possibly possess. Because here's the surprising part, the part that historians find almost poignant. Genghis did not initially want this war. He had his hands full in the east, and what he wanted from Khwarezm was trade. The Silk Road ran straight through the Shah's territory, and the Khan, ever the pragmatist, sent envoys proposing peaceful commerce, calling the Shah something like his honored equal, perhaps even addressing him as a son in the courteous language of diplomacy. He wanted goods to flow. He wanted caravans, not corpses. You can almost see an alternate history shimmering here, one where the two great powers simply got rich together. It was right there, within reach. And then a man named Inalchuk threw it all away. Inalchuk was a governor of the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar, and he was a relative of the Shah, which gave him a dangerous confidence. When a great Mongol trade caravan arrived, hundreds of merchants, camels heavy with goods, an enormous and valuable enterprise, sent in good faith. Inalchuk accused them of being spies. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he simply wanted the riches for himself. Either way, you watch him do the unthinkable. He seizes the caravan and has the merchants killed, everyone helping himself to their goods. Historians still argue over whether the Shah secretly ordered this or merely failed to punish it, but the distinction hardly mattered to what came next. Because Genghis, when the news reached him, did something that tells you a great deal about the man. He did not immediately explode into war. He restrained himself. He sent envoys, 3 of them to the Shah, demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for justice. It was a measured response, a last open door, a chance to make this right. The Shah's reply was almost breathtaking in its arrogance. He refused. And to underline the refusal, he had the chief Mongol envoy executed and the others humiliated, their beards burned off before sending them back to deliver the insult in person. Burn the beards of a Khan's ambassadors. Murder a man sent under the protection of peace. You can almost feel the temperature drop across the whole of Asia. There's a story that when the surviving envoys returned with their disfigured faces and their terrible news, Genghis climbed a hill alone and prayed for several days, asking the eternal sky for the strength to deliver justice. Whether that detail is true or a later embellishment, scholars genuinely debate, but the meaning behind it is unmistakable. This was no longer a matter of trade or even of vengeance for one caravan. The sacred Mongol principle that an envoy was inviolable had been spat upon, and the Khan was going to make an example so vast that no ruler would ever forget it. Consider for a moment the staggering foolishness of it from the Shah's side. The Khwarezmian army was by most counts enormous, possibly larger on paper than anything Genghis could bring. The Shah ruled fortified cities, rich provinces, a deep population. He had every material advantage. And he had squandered the one thing that might have saved him a peaceful, profitable relationship with the most dangerous man alive. Instead, over a governor's greed and a ruler's pride, he had personally guaranteed his own destruction. It is when you step back from it, one of history's most expensive temper tantrums. There was a flaw beneath the Shah's strength too, and the Mongol spies had surely noted it. His empire was young and his hold on it shaky. He didn't fully trust his own generals, many of whom commanded fierce Turkic warriors of uncertain loyalty. Rather than gather his vast forces into one great army and meet the Mongols in a single decisive battle, which his numbers might well have won, the Shah made a fateful choice. He scattered his troops among his many walled cities, garrisoning each one, hoping the strong walls would grind the nomads down the way walls always had. It was a catastrophic misreading of who he was facing. The Mongols, remember, had spent years in China learning exactly how to crack a city open. The Shah had handed them one by one the very kind of target they'd taught themselves to destroy and made sure none of those targets could come to the aid of any other. So the trap was set, though the Shah believed himself the one holding the knife. Somewhere out on the steppe, the Temüjins were assembling the engineers, sharpening their craft, the scouts mapping every road and river and weakness. A storm was gathering on the eastern horizon of his bright and beautiful kingdom, and he did not yet understand that he had summoned it himself with his own pride, over a pile of stolen goods. And as that gathering storm hangs heavy and unbroken in the distance, let the tension of it drain quietly away from you now. The gardens of Samarkand are still in bloom. In this fading moment, the fountains still murmuring, the great cities still whole and lamplit and unaware. All their sorrow lies ahead of them, and ahead is a country we need not visit tonight. For now everything is calm, suspended soft as the last light on the domes. That proud Shah and his doomed pride have long since settled into the deep silence of the centuries, where they can trouble no one, least of all you. You are warm. You are safe. The storm will keep until you wake. Rest now and let the quiet hold you. So the storm broke, the way storms do first, with a low rumble on the horizon, then all at once. You walk now through the streets of these jeweled cities in the last days, before they change forever, and you should let yourself feel how alive they are. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, these were among the brightest pearls of the medieval world crossroads where the Silk Road poured its treasures. Bolts of shimmering cloth spices that perfumed the air, glazed tiles in blues so deep they looked stolen from the sky. You move through the bazaars past scholars, arguing theology, past poets and astronomers, past gardens fed by clever channels of water in the middle of a dry land. This was civilization at a high polish. And it was about to meet the machine you watched being built on the steppe. The Mongols came in columns, splitting and converging according to a plan the Shah never managed to read. Genghis himself, in one of the great strategic strokes of his career, did something nobody expected. Instead of grinding through the frontier cities in order, he took a portion of his army and vanished into the Kaiselkum, a desert so harsh it was considered impassable. Guided by captured locals through its waterless heart, he emerged as if conjured deep behind the Shah's defensive line, appearing before Bukhara from the one direction no one was watching. Imagine the horror of the defenders. The enemy was supposed to be far to the east, and here he was at the gates, materialized out of dead ground. Historians still marvel at the audacity of that desert crossing, and they still argue over exactly which route he took, but the effect was pure psychological devastation. The Shah's whole scattered strategy began to unravel before a single great wall had truly been tested. Bukhara fell quickly. There's a famous and chilling scene the chroniclers preserved. Genghis Khan, it said, rode into the city, into the great mosque, and addressed the trembling population. He is reported to have told them that he was the punishment of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. Whether he truly spoke those exact words, or whether a later writer gave them to him, scholars genuinely debate, but the line has echoed down the centuries, because it captures something real about how the Mongols wanted to be understood, not as men you could bargain with, as weather, as fate. Then came Samarkand, the Shah's proud capital, defended by a large garrison, and by some accounts war elephants, exotic, terrifying beasts meant to shatter the nomad ranks. You can picture the defenders' confidence behind those formidable walls. It did not last. The Mongols deployed prisoners and conscripts before them as a human screen used their siege engineers, and probed for the weak seams in the city's resolve. The elephants, the story goes, proved more trouble than they were worth, and were eventually set loose. Within days, this great city that should have held for months had opened. The pattern repeated with a dreadful rhythm. The cities that surrendered swiftly and submitted were often spared, the worse made to pay and provide men but left standing. The cities that resisted, that killed envoys or held out and then fell, met fates that history records only in mournful, lowered voices. We will not walk into those darker streets tonight. It is enough to know that a terrible choice was offered to each city: submit or become a warning to the next, and that the warnings were made unforgettable. Urgench, the wealthy heart of Khwarezm proper, gave the Mongols their hardest fight of the whole campaign. Its defenders knew what awaited them, and so they fought street by street, house by house, with a desperate courage that turned the city into a long agony for both sides. Even the Mongols, masters of the swift kill, bled here. When it was over, the sources say the rivers and canals around the city were altered, the land itself reshaped by the violence, the kind of detail that lets you feel the scale without forcing you to look directly at the cost. And the Shah, the man who started it all with his pride, he did not stay to defend his cities. He fled. You watch this powerful ruler, this man of vast armies, become a fugitive, pursued relentlessly across his own crumbling empire by two of Genghis Khan's finest generals, Jebe and Subutai, who chased him with the patience of wolves running down a wounded deer. He ran from province to province, his authority dissolving behind him until at last he reached a small island in the Caspian Sea. Sick, broken, abandoned, his great empire reduced to a scrap of rock. There in poverty and despair, the Shah, who had burned the beards of envoys and murdered a caravan over greed, simply died with almost nothing, the way a candle gutters out. His son Jalal al-Din would fight on bravely for years, a genuinely able warrior, but the empire as a thing that could command the world was finished. In the space of a few short years, one of the most powerful and beautiful realms on earth had been erased from the map of great powers. The libraries, the gardens, the scholars, the markets that smelled of cardamom and dust many endured for life is stubborn, and cities are rebuilt. But the world that produced them had been broken open, and the Silk Road now ran, in a sense, straight through Mongol hands. And as the lamps of those ancient bazaars flicker low and the call of the merchants fades into the deepening dusk, let all of it grow gentle and distant now. The blue tiles cool in the falling dark, the fountains run quiet, the great domes stand silent against a sky going soft and violet and kind. All that splendor, all that sorrow has long since settled into the patient earth, where the proud Shah and the brave defenders and the weary riders alike lie down together and rest at last, troubling no one. You need not walk those streets any longer. You are here, warm and unhurried and wholly safe, and the only thing left to do is breathe slow and let the quiet carry you down. Sleep now. The Silk Cities sleep with you. You have watched him rise from a starving boy on the frozen plain to the master of an empire that stretched from the Pacific almost to the Caspian Sea. And now you must watch the one thing no conqueror, however terrible, has ever escaped. Genghis Khan was an old man by the standards of his hard world, his body worn by decades, in the saddle by wounds and falls and the relentless grind of war. But he was not finished. There was unfinished business waiting for him, and fittingly it lay back where his career of conquest had truly begun, with the kingdom of the Western Shah, the Tangut. Remember them, the Tangut, whom he had humbled years before and bound to tribute and obedience. Well, when Genghis was deep in his Western war against Khwarezm, and had asked the Tangut to send troops as vassals were obliged to do, they had refused, and worse, one of their officials had reportedly answered with a mocking jibe, suggesting that if the Khan's forces weren't strong enough to manage without help, perhaps he shouldn't be Khan at all. You may have noticed by now that insulting Genghis Khan tended to carry a rather steep interest rate. He did not forget, and once Khwarezm lay broken, he turned his weary, furious attention back toward the Tangut to settle the account in full. It was during this final campaign that the end came, and the circumstances are wrapped in a fog of competing stories that historians still argue over to this day. The most widely repeated account holds that the Khan was injured in a fall from his horse while hunting wild horses, a hard tumble that left him feverish and never quite well again. But there are other tales, whispered down the centuries, that he succumbed to a lingering illness, that an arrow wound festered, even a far more lurid and almost certainly invented legend involving a captured Tangut princess, which we'll leave politely in the realm of campfire rumor where it belongs. The honest truth is that nobody alive today knows exactly how the conqueror of the world died. He passed, by most reckonings, in the late summer of the year we'd call 1227. Somewhere in the borderlands of the kingdom he was busy destroying. And here is the part that gives you chills in the best way. With his final breath, the story goes, Genghis ordered that his death be kept secret, that the campaign against the Tangut be completed, and their capital taken before word of his passing could spread and embolden his enemies or unsettle his own people. His sons and generals obeyed, the Tangut capital fell, the kingdom was extinguished, and only then was the great Khan mourned. There's a darker thread to the legend too, that the funeral escort carrying his body home was so determined to preserve the secret that anyone who happened to cross their path was silenced, swept up into the silence, so that no living soul outside the inner circle would know the timing or the route. Whether that was literal truth or grim folklore, scholars genuinely debate, but it tells you how sacred and how guarded this final journey was meant to be. Because what came next is one of the great enduring mysteries of human history. Genghis Khan, by his own wish, was buried in secret in an unmarked grave somewhere in the homeland of his youth. Most likely, the tradition holds, near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, the peak where he had once hidden as a hunted young man, and to which he had prayed in his hours of greatest need. No grand tomb was raised. No monument marked the spot. The location was deliberately fiercely concealed in keeping with the customs of his people, who did not build pyramids for their dead but returned them quietly to the land that bore them. And the legends of that concealment have only grown more wonderful with time. One story says that 1,000 horsemen rode back and forth over the burial ground to trample away any trace of disturbed earth. Another claims that a forest was planted over the grave, or that a river was diverted to flow above it, hiding it forever beneath the water. Some tales speak of the burial party being eliminated to a man so the secret could never leak. Picture it, the most powerful person on earth, the man who reshaped continents, lowered into the ground with such total secrecy that 8 centuries later, with all our satellites and ground-scanning machines and tireless scholars, still have no idea where he lies. There's a delicious irony in it, isn't there? The man who left footprints across half the world left in the end no footprint at all. Modern searches have come and gone, some respectful and some less so, and Mongolia itself largely prefers the mystery preserved for many. Disturbing the resting place of the great ancestor would be a kind of sacrilege, and Burkhan Khaldun remains a protected and sacred place. So the conqueror sleeps exactly as he wished, beyond the reach of treasure hunters and historians alike. His bones return to the eternal blue sky and the endless grass that made him. He left behind not chaos, but a plan. Before he died, he had named his successor and divided the management of his vast realm among his sons, hoping, perhaps too hopefully, as you'll come to see, that the family would hold together what he had so violently bound. The empire did not die with him. That more than any tomb was his monument, a thing built to outlast its builder. And as the long secret funeral procession fades into the folds of the homeland hills and the mountain goes quiet beneath the gathering night, let your own thoughts grow soft and slow now. The great Khan is at rest, hidden and peaceful, exactly where he longed to be, beneath the grass, and the patient stars beyond all, striving beyond all war. Whatever thunder he once was has long since settled into the deep and gentle silence of the earth, where nothing can disturb him and nothing need disturb you. The hunt is over. The journey home is done. You are warm and still and wonderfully far from all of it, and the night around you asks nothing but that you close your eyes. Rest now. The conqueror sleeps, and so may you. Here is the moment every great empire dreads. The founder is gone, the towering figure who held everything together by sheer force of will and personality is lowered into his secret grave, and now the question hangs in the air like smoke does. It all fall apart. You've seen it happen countless times in history. A conqueror dies, his sons turn on each other, and within a generation the great map he drew is torn to confetti. So you watch the Mongol succession with a held breath, expecting the cracks to show. And what's genuinely surprising, what makes this story remarkable, is that at least for now they don't. Genghis had thought about this. The man who planned everything had not neglected to plan his own absence. He had 4 sons by his principal wife Berta, and he understood that the matter of who would follow him was a powder keg. The eldest was Jochi, remember him, the son born after Berta's rescue from the Merkit, the one whose paternity had always carried a shadow of doubt. That doubt poisoned his standing, and there was bitter rivalry between Jochi and the second son Chagatai, a stern traditionalist who never let the question of Jochi's birth rest quietly. The tension between those two was so sharp that the sources tell us Genghis realized neither could be named supreme leader without the whole family tearing itself apart. As it happened, Jochi died before his father did, which removed one source of conflict but left a lingering grief and grievance among his descendants that much later would matter enormously. So Genghis had passed over the obvious choices and settled on his 3rd son Ögedei, and here you see the old Khan's shrewdness one last time. Ogedai was not the fiercest warrior of the four nor the most domineering. He was something more useful for the job ahead. He was generous, even-tempered, widely, liked a man others could rally around without resentment. He was by every account fond of wine and feasting, perhaps too fond, but he had a gift for keeping the peace within the family, which at this fragile moment was worth more than any battlefield brilliance. And crucially, the fourth son Tolui, who commanded the largest share of the army and might have made a grab for power himself, deferred. After a customary period of mourning and manoeuvring, a great Kurultai was held, and in the year we'd call 1229, Ogedai was raised up as the second great Khan, the Khagan of the Mongol Empire. What follows should put to rest any idea that the Mongols were a one-man phenomenon. Under Ogedai, the empire did not merely survive, it surged. The wars resumed on multiple fronts at once, and the machine Genghis built proved that it could run and run beautifully under a new hand. In the east, the unfinished business with the Jin dynasty was at last brought to its conclusion. You'll recall the Jin had been beaten and broken but never quite extinguished, clinging on in their southern strongholds. Ogedai, working in a temporary and ultimately ill-fated alliance with the Jin's old rivals, the Southern Song, finally crushed them. By the early 1230s, the once mighty Jin dynasty was gone, entirely swallowed into the Mongol realm. One of the great powers of East Asia simply ceased to exist. But Ogedai's reign was about more than conquest, and this is the part that often surprises people. He turned his attention to the rather unglamorous but vital work of actually governing the enormous territory the Mongols had seized. With the help of capable administrators, remember that Khitan's scholar Yelu Chukai, who had argued that living subjects were worth more than empty land, Ogedai began building the bones of an actual state. He established a proper capital at Karakoram, deep in the Mongol heartland, a planned city that drew craftsmen, merchants, and envoys from across the known world. There's a wonderful, quirky detail the sources preserve. A captured European goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher built for Karakoram an elaborate mechanical fountain shaped like a silver tree, with pipes that dispensed wine and other drinks, and a mechanical angel that trumpeted to signal the server to pour. Picture that in the middle of the Mongolian steppe, a robotic drinks dispenser, the toast of the imperial court. It tells you something about the strange magnetic cosmopolitanism this empire was beginning to develop. Ogedai also formalized and expanded one of the most important Mongol innovations of all, the yam, the imperial relay system. Across the vast distances of the empire, a network of way stations was established, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and shelter. A messenger of the Khan could ride from one station to the next, swap his exhausted mount for a fresh one, and continue, allowing messages and officials to travel astonishing distances at speeds that would not be matched in much of the world for centuries. Imagine it as a kind of medieval pony express, but on a scale spanning a continent, the nervous system of the largest land empire ever assembled. Historians still argue over exactly how dense and how fast the network truly was at its peak, but its importance to holding the sprawling realm together is beyond dispute. And so far from collapsing, the empire under Ogedai was reaching a kind of confident maturity, still conquering ferociously, but now also taxing, administering, building, and connecting. The riders who had once known only the open steppe were learning to be rulers of cities and overseers of roads. The founder's gamble that his easygoing third son could hold it all together was paying off handsomely. And with the eastern flank secured and the home government strengthened, Ogedai was free to look outward again toward the west, toward lands the Mongols had only raided in passing, toward Russia and Europe, and the great campaign that would carry his nephews and generals to the very edge of the world. They knew, and as the silver tree of Karakoram trickles its last and the lamps of that improbable steppe capital dim, one by one let the bustle of the court soften and fade around you now. The messengers have stabled their tired horses, the envoys have gone to their rest, the great new city settles quietly beneath a wide and darkening sky. All that ambition, all that motion, has long since flowed away into the still waters of the past, where the generous Khan and his strange wine-pouring tree and his tireless riders all lie peacefully at rest, asking nothing of you. You need not travel any road tonight. You are home and warm and safe, and the night holds you gently. Let it. Close your eyes now and drift, while the empire keeps its quiet watch. So Urgadai looked west, and the west, you may be sure, had no idea what was coming. The great campaign he launched was placed under the nominal command of Batu, a son of that ill-fated eldest brother Jochi, and given its true strategic genius by an old and brilliant general you've already met in passing, Subutai, the same wolf who had run down the fleeing Shah of Khwarazm. Subutai was, by many reckonings, one of the finest military minds the world has ever produced, and now an old man, he would orchestrate the conquest of lands no steppe army had ever permanently held. Together they led an enormous host westward, and the first great target was the patchwork of Slavic principalities we now group together and call the Rus, the ancestors of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. These were not one country. They were a quarrelsome collection of city-states, Vladimir Ryazan, Kiev, and others, each with its own prince, each jealous of the next, rarely able to cooperate even when survival demanded it. And that disunity was once again exactly the weakness the Mongols fed upon. You watch the pattern repeat with grim familiarity. The Mongols would approach a city, often offer terms of submission first, and when those terms were refused, as the proud Rus princes tended to refuse them, the machine would go to work. But here is the detail that makes this campaign so distinctive, the thing that stuns military historians to this day. The Mongols invaded Russia in winter. On purpose. Every other army in history dreaded the Russian winter. It had broken invaders before and would break them again in centuries to come. The cold, the snow, the impassable mud of the thaw. These were supposed to be Russia's great shield. But the Mongols' men of the brutal steppe were utterly at home in the cold, and they understood something their enemies never grasped. In summer the Rus lands were a maze of dense forest swamp and unfordable rivers that broke up cavalry and slowed everything to a crawl. In the deep of winter, though, you watch the Temüjins come gliding across the frozen Volga and Oka, using the very rivers that should have protected the Rus as the avenues of their destruction. Historians still marvel at the sheer counterintuitive brilliance of it, turning a land's greatest defensive advantage into its fatal vulnerability. The cities fell one after another. Ryazan was among the first struck in the winter of the year we'd call 1237, and its fate was made a warning, as the resisting cities so often were. We'll not linger in those streets. Then came the great city of Vladimir and others, and the campaign rolled on with terrible momentum. The princes, fighting separately as they insisted on doing, were defeated separately. One grand prince gathered an army on a river called the Sit and was caught and destroyed there. Time and again the story was the same. A brave but isolated stand, a swift Mongol envelopment, another principality brought low. And then in the year we'd call 1240, the Mongols reached Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, the grand and golden capital, the very soul of the civilization. It was magnificent, ancient, full of churches and treasures, and its fall sent a shudder through all of Christendom. The chroniclers of the time wrote of the devastation in mournful, almost disbelieving tones, the way people write when their whole world has been overturned. Again, we'll leave the details in the soft shadows. What matters is the meaning. The political and cultural center of the Eastern Slavs had been shattered, and the long era that Russians would come to call the Mongol yoke had begun. Out of all this conquest, a new and lasting power crystallized, the Western Mongol realm that would become known to history as the Golden Horde. Batu and his successors did not generally occupy the Rus cities directly, did not move into them and rule street by street. Instead, they did something subtler and in its way more durable. They dominated from the steppe to the south and east, demanding tribute and obedience, and crucially demanding the right to confirm which prince held which throne. The Rus princes were left in place, but they now had to travel hat in hand to the Mongol court to receive a patent of authority, a yarlik that legitimized their rule. Refuse and you'd be replaced, or worse. For roughly 2.5 centuries, this arrangement shaped the lands of the Rus, channeling their wealth toward the horde and bending their politics around the will of the Khans. Historians still argue, sometimes fiercely, over what that long domination did to Russia in the deeper sense. Some say it isolated the Rus from the flowering of medieval Europe, stunting their development and leaving a legacy of autocracy. Others argue it was less heavy-handed than legend claims, and that one city in particular, a then minor place called Moscow, actually rose to greatness precisely by learning to play the Mongol game, cleverly collecting tribute on the horde's behalf, and quietly growing rich and powerful to the process until one day it would be strong enough to throw off the yoke entirely. That debate runs hot to this day, but no one disputes that the Mongol conquest bent the entire future course of Russian history. For now, though, the riders were not finished. With the Rus broken and the Golden Horde taking root, Batu and Subutai turned their gaze still further west toward the settled kingdoms of Catholic Europe, toward Poland, toward Hungary, toward lands that had heard only vague and terrifying rumors of the storm sweeping out of the east and were about to meet it face to face. And as the snow settles soft and deep over those frozen Russian rivers, muffling the world into a vast white silence, let the chill of it all melt gently away from you now. The ice roads lie quiet beneath the stars. The fallen cities have long since been rebuilt and fallen and risen again, and all the princes and riders of that distant winter have laid down their quarrels and their weapons and gone at last to their rest. The long night out there is peaceful now, the snow glowing faintly under a calm and patient moon, every sorrow folded away beneath it. You are not out in that cold. You are warm and held and wonderfully safe, with nothing to do but breathe slow and let the white silence carry you down. Sleep now. The frozen rivers sleep too. So the storm crossed out of the Russian forests and broke upon Catholic Europe, and you should understand just how unprepared that Europe was not in courage, for there was courage in plenty, but in understanding. The kings and knights of the West had heard rumors of some great calamity in the East, some heathen scourge devouring Christian Russia, but they imagined it as just another wave of raiders, the sort of nuisance their fathers had handled. A few even entertained a wild and hopeful fantasy that these mysterious Easterners might be the army of Prester John, a legendary Christian king from beyond the Muslim world, come to help them against their enemies. They were about to learn in the hardest possible way just how wrong they were. Subutai, that aging master of war, did something here that even today reads like the work of a mind from a later century. He divided his forces and launched simultaneous invasions of Poland and Hungary, coordinated across hundreds of miles, timed so that neither kingdom could come to the other's aid. The northern thrust into Poland was essentially a feint with teeth. Its job was to keep the Poles, the Germans, and their allies busy and bleeding, so they couldn't reinforce the main target, which was the rich kingdom of Hungary. That two armies, separated by a vast distance, could move in such deliberate harmony without radios, without anything but those flags and drums and tireless yam messengers, is the kind of thing that makes military historians shake their heads in wonder to this day. In Poland, the Mongols swept through and met a combined army of Polish and German forces, including formidable knights among them, members of the military orders, those armoured holy warriors who were the pride of Western chivalry, at a place called Legnica, sometimes called Lignitz, in the spring of the year we'd call 1241. The Christian host was confident. They had heavy cavalry, the most fearsome shock troops in Europe, knights encased in steel who could shatter most enemies with a single thundering charge. And you watch the Mongols handle them with almost contemptuous ease, using the oldest trick in their book, the feigned retreat. The knights, scenting victory, charged after the fleeing horsemen broke their own formation, became separated from their supporting infantry, and were enveloped and destroyed. There's a chilling, smoky legend that the Mongols collected ears from the fallen to count their grim tally. Whether that detail is true or a horror invented by terrified survivors, scholars genuinely debate. The flower of northern European chivalry was scattered, and the duke who led them was slain. 2 days later, and many miles to the south, the main Mongol army delivered the truly catastrophic blow at the Battle of Mohi on the plain near the Sajo River in Hungary. King Bela, the fourth of Hungary, had gathered a great army, genuinely large, and he was no fool, but he was facing Subutai at the height of his powers. The Hungarians made camp in a tight wagon-fortified position, and the Mongols surrounded them, raining arrows, and by some accounts even early gunpowder weapons and siege machinery into the packed and panicking host. And then this is the masterstroke: the Mongols deliberately left a gap in their encirclement, an apparent route of escape. It is one of the oldest and cruelest principles of war. A trapped enemy fights to the death, but an enemy who thinks he can flee will break and run. The Hungarians took the bait. They streamed out through the gap in a disorganized rout, abandoning their disciplined formation, and the waiting Mongol horsemen cut them down along the roads as they fled. We'll leave that long and sorrowful pursuit in the soft shadows where it belongs. King Bela escaped barely, a hunted fugitive in his own ruined kingdom, much as the Shah of Khwarazm had been years before. With both armies destroyed in the space of a single week, the gates of Central Europe stood open. The Mongols poured across Hungary, and the kingdom suffered grievously through the following year. They reached the Danube, and when that great river froze, they crossed it too, just as they had used the frozen rivers of Russia. Their scouts and raiding parties pushed further still into the lands that are now Austria, toward the Adriatic coast, chasing the fleeing Bela nearly to the sea. The chroniclers of the West wrote in tones of pure apocalypse, certain that the end of Christendom itself was at hand. There seemed to be no army left that could stop them. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, busy as ever, quarrelling with each other, offered little but words. Europe in that terrible season lay genuinely and almost helplessly exposed, and historians still argue over a tantalizing what-if that haunts this moment. Could the Mongols, had they simply continued, have ridden all the way to the Atlantic? Their tactics had defeated everything Europe threw at them. Their discipline, their mobility, their coordination, nothing the West possessed had proven equal to it. Some scholars insist Europe was saved only by sheer luck, that nothing on the ground could have stopped the Temüjins. Others argue that the deeper they pushed into the fragmented, castle-dotted, heavily forested terrain of Western Europe, the more their cavalry advantage would have eroded, and that the dense network of stone fortresses would have bogged them down in a way the open Hungarian plain never did. It's one of history's great unanswerable questions, and you can feel the whole future of a continent balanced on its edge. But the answer to whether the Mongols would ride on was about to be decided not on any European battlefield, not by any knight or king or castle wall, but by an event thousands of miles away in the heart of the empire that no one in Hungary could possibly have foreseen. And as the firelight of those terrible camps flickers low across the Hungarian plain and the frozen Danube gleams silver under the rising moon, let the dread of it all drain quietly out of you now. The armies are long stilled. The fugitive king long since came home and rebuilt his shattered realm, and all the fear that once gripped a continent has faded into the gentle hush of the centuries. The plains lie empty and peaceful under the stars, every sorrow folded softly away, and there is nothing left out there but the quiet wind moving over old grass. You are not on that plain. You are warm and safe and held far from every danger, and the night around you asks only that you rest. Let your breath go slow, let your thoughts go still. Sleep now, while Europe keeps its long and peaceful night. So picture it the spring of the year we'd call 1242. The Mongols are in Hungary, their scouts ranging toward Vienna and the Adriatic, the kingdoms of the West, reeling and all but defenseless. The chroniclers convinced the world is ending. And then, with no warning that any European could understand, the unthinkable happens. The whole vast machine, the Temüjins, the engineers, the supply train, the brilliant old Subutai himself, wheels eastward and rides away back across the rivers and the ruined lands, leaving a stunned and trembling Europe behind it spared. To the survivors it must have seemed like a miracle, like the hand of God reaching down to pluck the dagger from their throats at the last possible instant. They had no idea why it happened. For a long time almost nobody did. The answer lay thousands of miles to the east in the heart of Mongolia, and it had nothing to do with Europe at all. The great Khan was dead. Ogadai, the generous, wine-loving third son of Genghis, who had held the empire together and launched this very campaign, had died in the late autumn or early winter of the year we'd call 1241. By the time the news reached Batu and the Western Army the following spring, it carried a weight that overrode every battlefield consideration. Because here you arrive at one of the most fascinating structural truths of the whole Mongol story. The empire's greatest strength and its greatest weakness were the very same thing, the way power passed from one great Khan to the next. When a Khagan died, the empire's most important men were expected in many tellings required to return to Mongolia to attend the Kurultai, the great assembly where the next great Khan would be chosen. This was not a minor courtesy. The princes of the blood, the senior generals, the men who commanded armies and provinces all had a stake in who would rule next, because the new Khan would shape their fortunes for a generation. and Batu, the commander in the west, was a prince of the highest rank, a grandson of Genghis. The succession was his business in the deepest possible way. So was it for the other royal princes riding with the Western army. To stay in Hungary chasing castles while the throne of the world was being decided without them would have been not just foolish but potentially ruinous. So they went home. The conquest of Europe, so close to being achieved, was simply set aside, postponed in theory, but in practice abandoned forever. There is a delicious and humbling irony buried in this for those of us in the West who like to imagine our ancestors heroically holding the line. Europe was not saved by its knights who had been crushed. It was not saved by its kings who had fled. It was not saved by its castles or its faith or its famous chivalry. It was saved, as best anyone can tell, by an internal succession crisis in a steppe empire, by the death of one fond of drinking ruler far away, and by a constitutional custom that pulled the conquering army back toward home. Historians still argue over just how decisive this single factor was. Some hold that Ögedei's death is the whole story, the pure and simple reason the West survived. Others insist the Mongols were already overextended, that the Hungarian plain could not support their vast herds of horses indefinitely, that the dense fortifications of Western Europe would have slowed them regardless, and that they may have been looking for a reason to withdraw anyway. The truth probably weaves these threads together. But the timing, the army turning back at the very high water mark of its success precisely when the news arrived, is too striking to dismiss. And this same lethal flaw, you'll come to see, would surface again and again throughout the empire's history. The Mongols built the most fearsome war machine the world had ever known, but they never solved the problem of orderly succession. Genghis had passed over his quarrelling sons to choose the peacemaker Ögedei, and that had worked. But each transition after grew more fraught, more contested, more poisoned by the rivalries between the lines, descending from Genghis's different sons, the house of Jochi, the house of Chagatai, the house of Ögedei, the house of Tolui. Every death of a great Khan threatened to stall the entire empire, while its leaders rushed home to scheme and vote and maneuver. An empire that could conquer continents could not reliably hand a crown from one head to the next without crisis. There's something almost poetic in it, the thing that made them invincible abroad. Their unity under one supreme Khan was forever undermined by the impossibility of agreeing who that one Khan should be. What followed Ögedei's death proved the point. The succession did not resolve cleanly. There was a long interregnum with Ögedei's formidable widow Turigani ruling as regent and maneuvering to secure the throne for her son Guyuk against considerable opposition. It took years of intrigue before Guyuk was finally elevated, and his reign was brief and tense. Shadowed by a brewing and bitter feud with Batu himself, the two men, both grandsons of Genghis, despised each other, and the empire trembled on the edge of open civil war between them. Only Guyuk's own early death, as he marched west with an army in what may well have been a move against his cousin, prevented the clash. The cracks Genghis had worked so hard to paper over were beginning slowly to show, but that is a sorrow for later. For now, hold on to the strange wonder of this moment, a whole continent reprieved by an event it never saw, and could not have imagined the conquering tide receding for reasons no European would understand for centuries. And as that great army turns its back on the west and rides away into the eastern dusk, the dust of its passing settling slowly over the quiet Hungarian plain, let the long-held fear of these chapters finally loosen and fall away from you now. The danger has receded the way a tide goes out, gentle and complete, leaving the shore calm and the night soft and safe. All those anxious watchers on the walls of Europe slept soundly at last when the threat withdrew, and they have slept soundly ever since, every one of them, beyond all worry now. You may do the same. The storm has turned away. There is nothing left to fear tonight, nothing to guard against, only the warm quiet of your own safe room and the slow, easy rhythm of your breathing. Rest now. The riders have gone home, and so gently may you. So the empire had wobbled through Guyuk's brief, bitter reign and his sudden death, and now it teetered on the edge of the very thing Genghis had feared most, a true breaking of the family. The throne sat empty again, and the great houses descended from Genghis's sons circled it warily. The line of Ögedei, which had held the supreme office since the founder's death, wanted to keep it. But against them stood a formidable alliance, and out of the maneuvering emerged a new and consequential figure, Mungke, the eldest son of Tolui, that fourth son of Genghis, who had once stepped aside to let Ögedei rule. This was a turning point heavy with consequence, and you should feel the tension of it. With the powerful backing of Batu and the Western Mongols, who had no love for the house of Ögedei after their feud with Guyuk, Mungke was raised up as Great Khan in the year we'd call 1251. The supreme power had passed from the line of Ögedei to the line of Tolui, and the losers did not accept it gracefully. There were plots, real or alleged, against the new Khan, and Mungke responded with a sweeping and ruthless purge of his rivals among the houses of Ögedei and Chagatai. We'll not dwell on the grim details of that reckoning. What matters is that Mungke emerged from it with his grip on the empire tighter and firmer than any ruler since Genghis himself. The Toluid line, Mungke and his remarkable brothers, would dominate the rest of this story, and Mungke proved to be a serious, capable, energetic ruler, perhaps the last to truly hold the whole sprawling empire together by force of competence. He launched a great census across the realm, counting people and resources so they could be taxed and administered properly, the unglamorous machinery of actual governance. To curb the worst abuses of local officials, to bring order to the finances of a domain that stretched across the better part of a continent. He was in a sense consolidating, turning a collection of conquests into something more like a functioning state. There's a quirky and revealing scene from his court at Karakorum that the visiting European friar William of Rubruck recorded. A formal religious debate staged before the Khan between Christians, Muslims and Buddhists, each invited to argue their faith. Mungke listened, and his reported response captures the Mongol spirit perfectly. He likened the different religions to the fingers of a single hand, all part of one whole, and saw no reason to favor exclusively any one of them. Historians still discuss what that famous tolerance truly meant, whether it was deep conviction or shrewd statecraft, but it stands in striking contrast to the religious wars convulsing the rest of the world. Yet Mungke was no mere administrator. He was a grandson of Genghis, and the hunger for conquest ran in his blood. Having secured the center, he turned outward again, and here you see the astonishing reach of this empire at its zenith. Launching two enormous campaigns on two different fronts, thousands of miles apart more or less at once. He entrusted these great enterprises to his own talented brothers, keeping the supreme command of the family in Toluid hands. To the southwest he dispatched his brother Hulagu with a magnificent army charged with subduing the lands of the Middle East that had never fully submitted the stubborn fortress-dwelling sect that Europeans would call the Assassins. And beyond them, the great prize, the seat of the Islamic world, itself the Abbasid Caliphate in its glittering capital of Baghdad. That campaign, which will follow in its own right, would shake the foundations of the medieval Muslim world. And to the southeast, Mungke turned his attention to the last great unconquered power of East Asia, the southern Song dynasty of China. This was the rich, sophisticated, densely populated southern half of China that had survived while the northern Jin were destroyed. Conquering it was the great unfinished ambition of the dynasty, and it would prove the hardest nut the Mongols ever tried to crack, a land of rivers and rice paddies and mighty walled cities of terrain ill-suited to cavalry and a population in the tens of millions. Mungke entrusted much of this effort to another of his brothers, a thoughtful and ambitious man named Kublai, a name you'll want to remember, for he is destined to loom very large indeed before our story is done. And eventually Mungke, restless and determined, took the field in person to press the Song war himself. So picture the empire at this moment around the middle of the 13th century, very possibly the high noon of Mongol power. A single family united under one strong great Khan, simultaneously assaulting Baghdad in the west and the Song in the east, ruling from the Pacific to the gates of Europe, its census takers counting heads from Korea to the Russian steppe, its silver tree pouring wine in Karakorum, its messengers galloping along the Yam across distances no other power could imagine. It was in sheer extent the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen or would ever see again, and it was for this brief and shining moment more or less whole. But hold that image gently, because it is more fragile than it looks. The very campaigns Mungke was launching with such confidence would set in motion the events that before long would crack the empire apart for good. The unity you're watching at its peak is, though no one yet knows it already, entering its final season. And as the great Khan's census-takers fold away their scrolls and the lamps of Karakoram burn low over a court at the very summit of its power, let the weight of all that vast machinery settle softly into stillness now. The debates are finished, the armies have marched off over distant horizons, the counting houses have gone quiet, and the whole enormous empire seems to pause and breathe in the gathering dark. All that striving and ambition has long since flowed away into the deep calm waters of the past, where the able Khan and his brilliant brothers and their countless riders lie down together at last and rest untroubled beyond all reach of care. You need carry none of it. You are warm and safe and wonderfully far from every throne and every battlefield, and the night asks only that you let go. Breathe slow. Sink down. Sleep now while the great empire keeps its quiet midnight. So follow Hulagu, now Munka's brother, as he leads his great army southwest into the heart of the Islamic world, charged with bringing to heel everything that still defied the Mongol name. And his first task before the great prize of Baghdad was to deal with a foe that had terrified rulers across the region for generations, the Nizari Ismailis, the sect the wider world knew and feared as the Assassins. From their network of mountain strongholds, the most famous being the Eagle's Nest fortress of Alamut, perched high in the mountains of northern Persia, they had practiced a kind of terror that struck at kings and viziers in their own bedchambers, and their castles were considered all but impregnable. You watch Hulagu do what the Mongols always did to walls. He brought the engineers, the siege machines, the patient, relentless pressure. One by one, the mountain fortresses fell or surrendered, and Alamut itself, the legendary heart of the order, was taken. The famous library of Alamut, said to hold rare and precious works, was largely lost in the process, a foretaste of the greater loss to come. The power of the Assassins was broken, a thing kings had thought impossible. And then Hulagu turned toward the true objective, the city that was the spiritual and cultural heart of much of the Muslim world, Baghdad, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. You must understand what Baghdad was to grasp the enormity of what happened. For 5 centuries it had been the glittering capital of the caliphs, the successors of the Prophet in the eyes of Sunni Islam, a city of staggering wealth, learning and beauty. It was home to the House of Wisdom, the great institution of scholarship, where across generations the works of the ancient Greeks had been translated and preserved, where mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy had flourished, where the very numerals you use today and the algebra you may have struggled with in school owe a profound debt. Baghdad was in a real sense one of the great brains of human civilization. The reigning Caliph al-Mustasim was the spiritual leader of millions, but he was not the ruler his office demanded in such a moment. When Hulagu sent demands for submission, the Caliph, you might say, made the same catastrophic error of pride you've watched doom others in this story. He believed his city impregnable and his sacred office a shield, and he reportedly responded with defiance and threats, perhaps imagining that the whole Muslim world would rise to defend the seat of the Caliphate, or that divine wrath would smite any who dared attack it. He had badly misjudged both his own military weakness and the man at his gates. Historians still argue over how much the Caliph's own ministers contributed to the disaster, through poor advice or even quiet treachery. But the outcome was beyond doubt. Early in the year we'd call 1258, Hulagu's army surrounded Baghdad, and the engineers went to work. The siege was short. The walls were breached, the defences crumbled, and the great city was taken. And what followed was, even by the standards of this often sorrowful story, a catastrophe of the first magnitude, a sack so thorough and so devastating that it has echoed through Islamic memory ever since as a wound that never fully healed. We'll keep to the soft and mournful shadows here as we always do, and not walk into the streets. It is enough to say that the loss of life was immense, that the wealth of 5 centuries was carried off or destroyed, and that the Caliph himself was put to death by tradition in a manner that avoided the spilling of royal blood upon the ground. For even in destroying him, the Mongols observed their old taboo. The Abbasid Caliphate, that ancient and central institution, was simply extinguished. But it is the death of the books that history mourns most achingly, and that you should let yourself feel. The libraries of Baghdad, including the treasures of the House of Wisdom, were destroyed. The chroniclers tell us, and here legend and history blur, in a way scholars still debate, that so many manuscripts were thrown into the river Tigris that its waters were said to have run black with the ink washing out of them, even as they ran dark with sorrow from the city's other losses. Black with ink. Think on that image. The accumulated learning of centuries, the careful copying and translating and preserving of humanity's hard-won knowledge dissolving into a river. Whether the river's ran black detail is literal truth or a poet's grief made into legend, the deeper truth it carries is real. An incalculable wealth of human knowledge was lost in those days, works that existed nowhere else. Gone forever. There are things we will simply never know because of what happened to Baghdad. The fall of Baghdad sent a shockwave through the entire Muslim world that is difficult to overstate. The caliphate had been a symbol of continuity and unity, reaching back to the earliest days of Islam and its destruction, at the hands of these mounted strangers from the eastern grasslands, felt to many like the toppling of one of the pillars holding up the sky. The center of gravity of the Islamic world shifted, never to return to Iraq in quite the same way. Hulagu established his own Mongol realm across these conquered Persian and Mesopotamian lands. It would come to be called the Ilkhanate, and for the moment the Mongol tide seemed utterly unstoppable, sweeping toward the Mediterranean, toward Syria, toward Egypt, and the Holy Lands beyond. It seemed nothing could halt them. But that belief, as you're about to discover, was about to meet its first true test in the deserts of the Levant, where a power the Mongols had not reckoned with was preparing to do what no one had managed in 2 generations. And as the lamps of fallen Baghdad gutter out one by one, and the dark river carries its sorrows slowly out toward the sea, let the grief of it settle gently and finally into the deep stillness of the long ago. All that was lost has long since passed beyond pain, beyond reach, into the patient quiet of the centuries, where the scholars and their precious books and the proud caliph and the weary conquerors alike lie down together at last and rest. What was broken there cannot break again. It is over, and it is still, and it asks nothing of you now. You are warm and safe and far from every fire and every flood, and the night around you is kind. Let the dark river carry your cares away with it. Breathe slow. Let go. Sleep now while the old city keeps its peace. So the Mongol tide rolled on from ruined Baghdad, sweeping into Syria, and the cities of the Levant fell before Hulagu's army, much as Baghdad had. Aleppo was taken, and Damascus, that ancient jewel, opened its gates. The Mongols now stood at the very edge of the Holy Lands, their horses watering at the rivers of Syria, their scouts looking south and west toward the last great Muslim power standing between them and the Mediterranean and Africa beyond. To the Christian states still clinging to the coast, the remnants of the Crusader kingdoms, and to the Muslim world alike, it seemed the Mongols would simply keep going as they always had until they ran out of land. 2 generations of conquest had taught everyone a single grim lesson: you did not stop the Mongols. You only chose how you would lose to them. And then far to the east something happened that would once again bend the whole course of history, the same flaw you've watched surface again and again. The great Khan Munka died in the year we'd call 1259 while campaigning against the Southern Song in China. And just as it had with Europe, the death of the supreme ruler reached deep into the Western campaigns and pulled at them. Hulagu, a prince of the blood with an enormous stake in who would become the next great Khan, withdrew the bulk of his great army back toward the east, to be near the succession, taking the largest part of his force with him out of Syria. He left behind a much smaller army under one of his finest generals, a Christian Mongol named Kitbuka, to hold the conquered lands. It was still a formidable force, but it was no longer the overwhelming hammer that had shattered Baghdad. The door that fate had been holding shut for the Mongols' enemies had for one brief moment swung open, and there was at last an enemy ready and able to walk through it: the Mamluks of Egypt. Now, the Mamluks were one of the most extraordinary military institutions in all of history, and you should savor how strange and formidable they were. They were slave soldiers. The word itself means something like owned. As boys they had been purchased, many of them in a delicious twist of fate. Turkic and Kipchak peoples from the very steppes the Mongols had conquered sold into the slave markets after the Mongol conquests displaced them. They were raised from childhood in rigorous military training, converted to Islam, and forged into an elite warrior caste of mounted archers and heavy cavalry, every bit as disciplined and skilled as the Mongols themselves, because in a sense, they came from the same world. And these slave soldiers had grown so powerful that they had seized control of Egypt, outright ruling it as a warrior aristocracy. Here then were horsemen who fought like Mongols, knew steppe tactics like Mongols, and were utterly determined not to share the fate of Baghdad. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo demanding submission, the Mamluk leadership, driven by the fierce Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars, a towering figure who would loom large in what followed, gave their answer in the bluntest possible terms. They executed the envoys. You'll recall what executing Mongol envoys had meant for the Shah of Khwarezm. The Mamluks knew exactly what they were doing. It was a declaration that there would be no submission, only war to the death. And then they did the audacious thing. Rather than wait in Egypt for the storm, they marched north into Palestine to meet the Mongols head-on open ground. The two armies met in the year we'd call 1260, at a place in the Jezreel Valley of what is now northern Israel called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, a name heavy with old significance. And here for once you watch the Mongols meet their match in every particular. The Mamluks fought with steppe tactics of their own. By the most repeated account, Baybars used the Mongols' own favourite trick against them, a feigned retreat drawing Kitbuka's force forward into a prepared trap where the main Mamluk army concealed and waiting fell upon them from the flanks. The fighting was fierce and the outcome hung in the balance, but when it was over, the Mongol army was decisively beaten. Kitbuka himself was captured and killed. We'll leave the field there in the soft quiet. The thing that mattered had happened. The Mongols had been defeated in a pitched battle soundly and unmistakably, and forced to abandon Syria. You cannot overstate the psychological earthquake of this. For 2 generations across the entire breadth of Asia, the Mongols had seemed quite literally invincible, a force of nature, a punishment from God, unstoppable by any earthly army. Ain Jalut shattered that spell. It proved for the first time, in a way no one could deny, that the Mongols could be beaten by a determined and skillful foe. The myth of invincibility, perhaps the Mongols' most powerful weapon of all, was broken on that Syrian field. Historians still argue over how decisive the battle truly was in the long run, whether the divided, distracted Mongols would have held Syria anyway given their succession troubles, or whether Ain Jalut genuinely marked the high tide of their westward expansion. But its symbolic weight is beyond dispute. It set the limit of the Mongol advance in the southwest more or less permanently. Egypt and the Mamluks would endure. The Holy Lands would not become Mongol. A line had been drawn in the desert sand, and for once the Mongols did not cross it. And so the great western tide, which had risen so high and so terribly, finally reached its furthest shore and began at last to recede. And as the dust of that hard-fought valley drifts down and settles in the cooling evening air, let the long tension of the Mongol advance finally ease and release within you now. The springs of that ancient valley run clear and quiet again, the armies long since vanished. Every blade and banner laid to rest beneath the patient earth, where Mamluk and Mongol alike have slept in peace for centuries beyond counting. The fierce struggle is over, finished, gone soft and still as the desert night, and it troubles no one anymore, least of all you. You are warm and safe and held far from every battlefield, with nothing left to do but breathe and let the stillness gather around you. The line is drawn, the tide has turned. Rest now, and let the quiet desert keep its long and peaceful watch. So Monka was dead, and his death did more than just rescue Egypt. It triggered the very crisis that Genghis had spent his life trying to prevent. With the great Khan gone, the question of succession fell, this time between 2 of Monka's own brothers, and the empire would never truly be whole again. On one side stood Kublai, remember him, the thoughtful and ambitious brother entrusted with the war against the Song, a man who had spent years among the Chinese, drawn to their civilization, their administrators, their ways of governing settled lands. On the other stood their youngest brother Erik Buk, who had remained in the Mongol heartland at Karakorum, and who represented the more traditional steppe faction. Those who feared Kublai was becoming too Chinese, too settled, too far from the old nomadic soul of the people. Both brothers held rival Kurultais, and both were proclaimed Great Khan, and the result was exactly what the founder had dreaded: a civil war within the family, Mongol against Mongol. You watch the brothers fight for several years, until Kublai, with his greater resources drawn from the rich lands of northern China, finally prevailed and forced Arik-Bok to submit. Kublai emerged as Great Khan, but here is the crucial, irreversible thing. Though he had won the title, his real authority now extended firmly only over the eastern portion of the empire. The other great branches of the family, the Golden Horde in the Russian steppe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and even increasingly the Elkhanate in Persia, went their own ways, acknowledging Kublai's supremacy in name when it suited them and ignoring it when it did not. The single unified empire of Genghis and Mongol was from this point on effectively finished. What remained were independent Mongol realms, sometimes allied, sometimes at war with one another. Kublai was the last man to hold the title of Great Khan with any real meaning, and even he held a fraction of what his grandfather had built. But oh, what a fraction it was! Kublai turned his energies to the great unfinished task, the conquest of the southern Song, the rich and populous heart of China that had defied the Mongols for so long. This was no lightning step campaign. It was a long, grinding war of sieges against a sophisticated and determined enemy, fought across rivers and rice paddies where cavalry counted for less. The pivotal struggle centered on the twin fortress cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng, guarding the Han River, which held out against the Mongols for years in an epic siege. To crack them, Kublai did the characteristically Mongol thing: he imported expertise, bringing in Muslim engineers from the West who built powerful counterweight trebuchets, mighty siege machines that finally battered the great fortresses into submission. With that key turned, the way into the Song heartland lay open. The Mongols, who had never been a naval people, even built fleets and fought river and sea battles to complete the conquest. By around the year we'd call 1279, the last Song resistance was extinguished in a final desperate sea battle, and all of China, north and south, lay under Mongol rule for the first time in history. We'll leave that last sorrowful stand in the soft shadows. The thing was done, China was whole, and it was Mongol. And here Kublai did something his nomadic ancestors might scarcely have recognized. Rather than rule China as a foreign conqueror perched on the steppe, he embraced the role of a Chinese emperor. He proclaimed a new dynasty in the Chinese fashion, taking a Chinese dynastic name, the Yuan, and presenting himself as the legitimate son of heaven, heir to the long line of emperors who had ruled the Middle Kingdom. He moved his capital from the old steppe heartland to a magnificent new city in the north, at the site of modern Beijing, which he called Dadu, the great capital. There he built a palace complex of legendary splendor, the seat of an empire that fused Mongol power with Chinese sophistication. The boy whose great-grandfather had dug for roots on the frozen plain now sat enthroned in one of the most magnificent courts on earth. It was Kublai's court that would become, in the Western imagination, the very image of exotic Eastern magnificence, thanks largely to a Venetian traveller who claimed to have spent years in the Khan's service. Marco Polo's accounts of the wealth, the bustling cities, the paper money, the coal burned as fuel, the sheer scale and organization of Kublai's realm would astonish and frankly be disbelieved by Europeans for generations. Historians still argue, sometimes heatedly, over how much of Marco Polo's tale is first-hand truth, how much is exaggeration, and whether he saw everything he claimed. Some even question whether he reached China at all, but the splendor he described was real enough, and it would help plant in the European mind a dream of the fabulous wealth of the East that would centuries later send explorers sailing west in search of it. The poet Coleridge would one day conjure a fevered, dreamy vision of Kublai's pleasure dome at Xanadu, the summer capital of Shangdu, cementing the Khan forever in the Western imagination as a figure of almost mythical grandeur. Kublai ruled wisely, in many ways patronizing the arts, tolerating the empire's many religions, fostering trade, and adopting much of the sophisticated Chinese machinery of government, though he was careful to keep Mongols and other foreigners in the highest positions, never fully trusting his vast Chinese population to rule itself. He had achieved something staggering, a settled, splendid, enduring empire. And yet the seeds of trouble were there too, as you'll come to see. The Yuan, for all its glory, would prove one of the shorter-lived of China's great dynasties, and Kublai's own later years would be shadowed by grief and by ambitions that overreached, by ventures across the sea that would end not in glory but in disaster. And as the lamps of Kublai's great palace glow warm against the northern night and the splendid court at last falls silent, let yourself drift down gently with the fading of its golden light. The music has stopped, the envoys have gone to their rest, the pleasure domes stand quiet beneath a calm and ancient moon, and all that dazzling magnificence has long since passed softly into the deep still waters of the past, where the great Khan and his glittering court lie peacefully at rest, troubling no one. You need hold none of its weight. You are warm and safe and wonderfully far from every throne, and the night around you asks only that you let go and sink into its quiet. Breathe slow. Rest now, while Kublai's splendid city keeps its peaceful sleep. So picture Kublai Khan at the height of his power, master of all China, the most powerful ruler on earth by most measures, seated in his splendid capital. And yet, like every Mongol before him, he was not a man easily satisfied with what he held. Across the sea to the east lay the islands of Japan, a land that had never bowed to any foreign power, ruled in practice by its warrior class under the shogunate, while the emperor reigned as a sacred figurehead. To Kublai, Japan was an affront, a wealthy, civilized neighbor that had not acknowledged his supremacy. So he did what Mongol Khans did. He sent envoys demanding that Japan submit and pay tribute or face the consequences. The Japanese, to their lasting credit, and to Kublai's growing fury, essentially ignored him. The military government in Kamakura, led by the young regent Hojo Tokimune, read the demands, understood the threat, and chose defiance. Some of Kublai's envoys were reportedly turned away. Later ones met harsher fates. You can imagine how this sat with a man whose grandfather had built an empire on the principle that defiance was answered with annihilation. Kublai resolved to do what no one had done before, to carry the Mongol war across open water and conquer an island nation. And here he ran headlong into the one element the masters of the steppe had never truly conquered: the sea. The first invasion came in the year we'd call 1274. Kublai assembled a great fleet crewed and built largely by his recently conquered Korean subjects, and an army of Mongol, Chinese and Korean troops. They crossed the strait, seized the outlying islands of Tsushima and Iki along the way, and will leave the fate of those small islands in the soft shadows, for they bore the first brunt of it and then landed in Hakata Bay on the Japanese mainland of Kyushu. There the Mongols met the samurai, and the clash of two utterly different ways of war was something to behold. The samurai, schooled in a tradition of individual honor and single combat, at first found the disciplined Mongol formations, their massed arrows, their coordinated tactics, and their strange exploding projectiles bewildering and deadly. The fighting went hard against the defenders, and then after only a day or so of fighting, the invaders withdrew to their ships for the night, and the sea rose against them. A great storm blew in, and the fleet caught in the exposed bay was battered terribly. Many ships were wrecked, large numbers of men drowned, and the survivors limped home to Korea with the invasion in ruins. The first attempt had failed, undone less by the samurai than by the wind and the water. Kublai predictably did not take this as a hint to leave Japan alone. He spent years preparing a second invasion on a far grander scale, and in the meantime, the Japanese, wisely anticipating his return, did something clever. They built a defensive stone wall along the shore of Hakata Bay, a barrier specifically designed to blunt a seaborne landing and deny the Mongol cavalry room to deploy. When the Second Great Armada came in the year we'd call 1281, it was enormous by traditional accounts. Combining a fleet from Korea with a second, even larger fleet, sailing from conquered southern China. The numbers the chronicles give are staggering, and historians still argue over how wildly exaggerated they may be, but there is no doubt it was a vast undertaking. And this time the Japanese were ready. The defensive wall did its work, denying the invaders an easy landing. The samurai, having learned from the first invasion, fought with adapted tactics, raiding the anchored Mongol ships in small boats by night, harrying the landings, refusing to give the invaders the foothold they needed. For weeks, the great fleet struggled in the waters off Kyushu. Unable to break through, the soldiers crowded miserably aboard their ships in the summer heat. And then, extraordinarily, almost unbelievably, it happened again. A massive typhoon swept in from the sea and fell upon the enormous fleet with catastrophic force. We'll keep to the gentle shadows here and not dwell on the scale of the drowning, but it was immense. The great armada was largely destroyed, ships dashed together and broken and sent to the bottom, the invasion annihilated by the storm. Twice now, a great wind had risen from the sea at Japan's moment of greatest peril and shattered the fleets of the most powerful empire on earth. To the Japanese, this could be no coincidence. They named these storms the kamikaze, the divine wind, and understood them as proof that their islands were sacred, protected by the gods themselves, inviolable. That belief would sink deep into the Japanese sense of national identity and destiny, and the word itself, kamikaze, would echo with terrible resonance some 7 centuries later in another and very different war. Historians today, ever the spoilsports, point out more earthly factors, the hastily built ships of the Second Fleet. Some perhaps constructed by reluctant conquered labourers and ill-suited to the open sea, the poor anchorage, the timing that left the fleet exposed during typhoon season. Recent underwater archaeology off the Japanese coast has even turned up the wreckage of these lost fleets, lending hard evidence to the old stories. But whatever the precise mix of wind and wood and bad luck, the result was beyond dispute. Japan had stopped the Mongols cold twice and remained unconquered. For Kublai, it was a humiliation and a vast waste of men and treasure, one of several overreaching ventures. In his later years, he would also send costly and largely fruitless expeditions toward Vietnam, Burma, and the distant islands of Java, learning the hard lesson that the tactics which conquered the tactics. Open steppe faltered in jungles and across oceans. The empire had found its limits, and the seas around Japan marked one of the most dramatic of them all. And as those 2 great storms settle at last into calm, and the eastern sea grows smooth and silver beneath a quiet sky, let the roar of wind and wave fade softly into stillness within you now. The drowned fleets have long since gone to their rest on the peaceful sea floor. The samurai and the soldiers alike laid down their arms centuries beyond counting, and the divine wind has blown itself out into the gentle hush of the long ago, troubling no one anymore. The waters lie flat and tranquil. Now the storm, forgotten the night, kind and still. You are warm and dry and safe, far from every wave, with nothing to do but breathe slow and let the calm sea carry you down. Rest now while the quiet ocean keeps its peace. So now step back from the sieges and the storms and the burning cities, and let yourself see something gentler and in its way just as world-changing. For all the terror the Mongols unleashed, they also created across the vast territories they came to rule, a thing historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It is one of history's great paradoxes, and you should let the strangeness of it settle. In the same people who had killed on such a staggering scale also presided over an era of trade, travel and exchange, so safe and so free-flowing that it knit together the eastern and western halves of the known world as never before. Think about what it meant to have a single power or a cluster of related Mongol powers controlling the entire length of the Silk Road and the steppe highways from China to the borders of Europe. Before the Mongols, a merchant trying to carry goods across Asia faced a gauntlet of dozens of petty kingdoms, each with its own tolls, its own bandits, its own wars, its own languages and laws. Under the Mongols, much of that fragmentation vanished. There was for roughly a century a kind of common order across the continent. The Mongols, who depended on trade and prized merchants, made the roads safe, fiercely, ruthlessly safe. There's a famous saying preserved by medieval writers, that under the Mongol peace a maiden bearing a pot of gold could ride alone across the length of the realm without fear of harm. Whether that was ever literally true, or a bit of imperial public relations, scholars genuinely debate, but it captures a real and remarkable phenomenon. The roads of Asia were for a time open and astonishingly secure. And along those open roads flowed not just silk and spices and silver, but ideas, technologies, religions, people, and in a darker turn will come to disease. This is the great gift the Mongols inadvertently gave to history, the cross-pollination of civilizations that had been largely sealed off from one another. Chinese innovations made their long journey westward during this era, and the centuries it opened up gunpowder, printing, the magnetic compass, paper money, all technologies that would, in time, utterly transform Europe and help launch it toward the modern age. There is a real and humbling irony here. The Mongol conquests, for all their destruction, may have done more to connect the world and accelerate the spread of transformative technology than any peaceful endeavor of the age. Historians still argue over just how much credit the Mongols deserve for this transmission, but few deny that the bridge they built between East and West carried cargo that would change everything. It was this connected world that allowed travelers like Marco Polo to make their famous journeys, the Venetian merchant making his way along the secured trade routes to the court of Kublai Khan, then home again to dazzle and bewilder Europe with tales of the wonders he had seen. But Marco Polo was far from alone, even if he is the most famous to Western ears. Remember that European friar, William of Rubruck, who travelled to Karakorum and recorded the religious debate at Munka's court, and that marvellous silver drinking fountain tree. He made his journey along these same Mongol-secured roads, and the traffic ran in every direction, not merely from west to east. One of the most remarkable travellers of the age went the other way entirely, a Christian monk named Rabban Bar Sauma, born near Mongol-ruled Beijing, who travelled all the way west across the whole breadth of the connected world to Persia, and then on to Europe itself, where he met kings and the Pope as an envoy of the Mongol Ilkhanate. Think of that, a man born in China in the 13th century dining with the King of England and the King of France. Such a journey was almost unthinkable before the Mongols, and would become unthinkable again after they were gone. It is the Pax Mongolica in a single astonishing life. The exchange ran deeper still. The Mongols deliberately moved skilled people around their empire to where their talents were needed. Persian astronomers and physicians travelled east to serve at the Chinese court, while Chinese techniques in medicine, art and administration travelled west into Persia. The Ilkhanate in Persia became a glittering centre of learning under Mongol patronage, where a great scholar and statesman named Rashid al-Din compiled what some consider the first true world history, a sweeping attempt to tell the story of all the peoples the Mongols had encountered, from the Chinese to the Franks of Europe, in a single work. Maps improved. Knowledge of geography expanded. The very idea of the world as a connected whole, rather than a scattering of isolated and half-legendary lands, took firmer root in the human imagination. Because the Mongols had, however, brutally stitched that world together, and the religious tolerance you saw at Munka's court was woven through all of it. The Mongols, with their own shamanic traditions and their general policy of not much caring what their subjects believed, so long as they obeyed and paid, allowed an extraordinary mingling of faiths across their realm. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and others moved and traded and worshipped across the empire with a freedom that much of the more religiously rigid world could scarcely imagine. Over time, the different Mongol Khanates would themselves adopt the faiths of the peoples. They ruled the Western Khanates, largely embracing Islam, the Yuan in China, leaning toward Buddhism. But the era of open exchange left its mark everywhere. It would not last forever. The peace depended on Mongol unity and Mongol power, and as you've already glimpsed, both were fracturing. But for one shining and improbable century, the world had been more connected than ever before, and the consequences of that connection would ripple forward for centuries, shaping the rise of the very Europe that would one day dominate the globe. And as those long, open roads stretch away quiet beneath the evening stars, and the last caravan beds down for the night at some lamplit way station, let the whole vast connected world grow soft and peaceful around you now. The merchants have unloaded their camels, the travellers have laid down their staffs, the great highways of Asia lie still and silver under a calm and watching sky. Every journey paused, every road at rest. All that movement and wonder has long since flowed away into the deep, gentle waters of the past, where the travellers and traders and dreamers alike sleep soundly, their long journeys done. You need walk no further tonight. You are home and warm and safe, and the quiet of the whole wide world settles softly over you like a blanket. Rest now, while the long roads sleep. So you've seen the empire at its dazzling height, connected splendid ruling from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. But you've also caught again and again the glint of the fatal crack running through it, and now you must watch that crack widen until the whole great structure comes apart. The truth is that the unified Mongol Empire, the single realm ruled by one great Khan, whose word ran from Korea to the Black Sea, did not survive much past the middle of the 13th century in any real sense. By the time Kublai sat in his splendid Chinese capital, the empire of Genghis had already quietly ceased to be one thing and become several. The deepest cause, as you've watched unfold from the very beginning, was that flaw in the heart of the system, the absence of any settled, peaceful way to pass power from one great Khan to the next. Each succession had become more bitterly contested than the last, and the civil war between Kublai and his brother Arik Beg had been the breaking point. After that struggle, the bonds holding the family realms together were never truly repaired. The empire settled into four great fragments, four khanates, each descended from a different line of Genghis's blood, each increasingly going its own way. In the east there was Kublai's own realm, the Yuan dynasty ruling China and the Mongol homeland, claiming the senior title of Great Khan, but in practice commanding obedience mainly within its own borders. In the southwest sat the Ilkhanate Hulagu's realm, ruling Persia and the Middle East. In the vast steppes of Central Asia lay the Chagatai Khanate, the most restless and unstable of the four, descended from Genghis's stern second son, and in the north and west sprawled the Golden Horde dominating Russia, and the western steppe descended from the line of Jochi, that eldest son, whose disputed birth had cast a shadow over the family from the start. These were no longer provinces of a single empire. They were independent states, with their own rulers, their own interests, their own quarrels. And quarrel they did with each other, Mongol against Mongol, in a way that would have appalled Genghis. The bitterest of these conflicts pitted the Ilkhanate against the Golden Horde. The two realms shared a contested border in the Caucasus, and they fell out badly, partly over territory and partly over religion, for the Golden Horde was embracing Islam while Hulagu's Ilkhanate, the very power that had sacked Baghdad and extinguished the Caliphate, was viewed by the Muslim Golden Horde as an enemy of the faith. In one of the great ironies of the age, the Muslim Golden Horde actually allied with the Mamluks of Egypt, the very people who had stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut against their own Ilkhanate cousins. The descendants of Genghis were now making common cause with his enemies against one another. The unity that had made the Mongols invincible had curdled into the same kind of internecine warfare that had once made the steppe tribes such easy prey back before a hungry boy united them. Within each Khanate, too, the slow work of transformation was underway, and it carried a quiet poignancy. The Mongols were always a small ruling minority, sitting atop vast populations of conquered peoples, and over generations the conquerors were gradually absorbed by the conquered. In Persia and the Western Khanates, the Mongols converted to Islam and increasingly adopted Persian and Turkic culture and language, until the distinctly Mongol character of their rule faded into the older civilizations they governed. In China, the Yuan remained more aloof, deliberately keeping themselves apart from their Chinese subjects, but that very aloofness bred resentment, and it would cost them. Historians still argue over whether this absorption represents the Mongols losing their identity, or simply the natural fate of any small conquering elite ruling great, settled civilizations, but the pattern is unmistakable across the whole sweep of the former empire. The Ilkhanate would be among the first of the great Khanates to fall, dissolving in the early 14th century, when its ruling line failed to produce a lasting heir, and the realm splintered into squabbling fragments. The Chagatai Khanate fractured and refractured, and out of the wreckage of these Central Asian lands late in the 14th century would rise one final, terrifying echo of the old Mongol fury, a conqueror named Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, who claimed the mantle of Genghis and carved out a vast empire of his own through campaigns of staggering brutality. But Timur, for all his ferocity, was a kind of after-image, a man invoking a glory that had already passed. His empire, too, would crumble after his death. The age of the true Mongol world empire was over, and what remained were successor states, living on the memory and the bloodline of something that had once spanned the earth. There is something almost melancholy in watching it after everything you've seen. The empire was not conquered. No outside power rose up and defeated the Mongols and tore their realm apart. They were, in the end, undone largely by themselves, by their own inability to share power peacefully, by the sheer size of what they had built, by the gravitational pull of the rich civilizations they had swallowed, which slowly drew the conquerors in and made them part of the conquered world. The greatest land empire ever forged dissolved not with a single great catastrophe, but with a long, gradual loosening, a drifting apart the way a great gathering breaks up into smaller and smaller groups as the night wears on and people begin, one by one, to make their way home. And as those four great realms drift quietly apart, and the lamps of the scattered Mongol courts burn low across half a darkening world, let the long story begin to settle and soften toward its close within you now. The quarrels have all been quieted by the centuries, the borders long since redrawn and redrawn again, the proud khanates faded gently back into the older lands that bore them, every rivalry laid finally to rest. All that vast splendor and striving has flowed away at last into the deep still waters of the past, where the children of Genghis sleep peacefully in their separate kingdoms, troubling no one, their long quarrels forgotten. You need carry none of it. You are warm and safe and held far from every contested border, and the night asks only that you let the great empire go gently to its rest. Breathe slow. Sink down. Sleep now while the scattered kingdoms keep their quiet. So you come at last to the long twilight, the slow fading of the greatest empire the world has ever known, and to the strange and lasting echo it left behind. The fragments you watched drift apart in the last chapter did not vanish all at once. They lingered, dwindled, transformed, and finally dissolved over the course of generations. But there was one force, born of the very connectedness the Mongols had created, that struck a hammer blow against the world they had made and against much of the world beyond it. Remember the Pax Mongolica, those open roads along which goods and ideas and travellers flowed so freely. Along those same roads in the middle of the 14th century travelled something far darker, a pestilence. The disease we remember as the Black Death is widely thought to have emerged from the heart of Asia and ridden the Mongol trade routes westward, carried by merchants and armies and the fleas upon the rats in their baggage, until it reached the Black Sea and crossed into Europe, where it killed in numbers so vast that we still struggle to comprehend them. There is a grim story which historians still debate, that the plague first leapt toward Europe during a Mongol siege of a trading city on the Black Sea coast. When the disease broke out among the besiegers and the bodies of the dead became in effect the first weapon of biological horror flung over the walls. We'll leave that dark scene in the soft shadows where such things belong. But the deeper truth is haunting the same empire that connected the world, also unknowingly, built the highway along which one of history's greatest catastrophes would travel. The bridge between East and West carried both wonders and death. The plague helped shake the foundations of the Mongol order itself. In China, the Yuan dynasty, Kublai's proud creation, was already weakening, beset by natural disasters, ruinous floods of the Yellow River, economic troubles from overprinted paper money, and the simmering resentment of a vast Chinese population that had never accepted its foreign rulers. Rebellions broke out, and in the year we'd call 1368, the Mongols were driven out of China altogether. A Chinese rebel of humble peasant origins seized the throne and founded the Ming dynasty, and the Yuan court fled back north to the steppes, from which Genghis had first ridden back to the grasslands, back to the felt tents, the wheel come. Full circle after little more than a century of glory. The Mongols who returned to the steppe lived on for centuries, as the people they had always been, sometimes uniting under able leaders, sometimes fragmenting but never again threatening to swallow the world. The other khanates faded too, each in its own way and its own time. The Golden Horde, which had dominated Russia for so long, slowly weakened and fractured into smaller khanates, and that once minor city of Moscow, which had grown rich and cunning under Mongol overlordship, you'll recall at last grew, strong enough to defy and then to throw off the Mongol yoke entirely, beginning its own long rise toward empire. The Mongol successor states in Central Asia lingered longest of all. Remarkably, rulers claiming descent from Genghis Khan would govern various Central Asian lands for centuries, and one of his descendants, a prince named Babur, would sweep down into India and found the magnificent Mughal Empire, the very name Mughal being a version of the word Mongol, which would rule much of the subcontinent into the modern age and raise monuments like the Taj Mahal. The bloodline of the hungry boy from the frozen steppe reached in the end almost unimaginably far. And what are we to make of it all now that the dust of 8 centuries has settled? The Mongols left scars that have never fully healed and gifts the world still draws upon, often without knowing it. They redrew the map of Asia. They reshaped Russia, China, Persia, and the Islamic world, bending the course of each toward the future it would ultimately follow. They connected East and West and accelerated the flow of technology and knowledge that would, with deep irony, help launch the very European age that would one day dominate the globe the Mongols had briefly united. Historians still argue fiercely and endlessly over the final balance of it, whether Genghis Khan should be remembered chiefly as one of history's great destroyers, a bringer of death on an almost incomprehensible scale, or as one of its great unifiers and connectors. The man who, however, brutally knit the world together and dragged it bleeding and astonished toward modernity. The truth, as it so often does, refuses to settle neatly on either side, and perhaps it never will. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is no villain but a revered father of the nation, his face on the currency, his name on the airport, his memory, the proud center of a people's identity, a reminder that history wears very different faces, depending on where you stand to look at it. And out on those same endless grasslands, where it all began, beneath that same eternal blue sky you felt at the very start of this long night, herders still ride their shaggy ponies, much as their ancestors did. And somewhere in a secret and unmarked place near a sacred mountain, the bones of the monarch's conqueror still rest exactly as he wished, beyond the reach of all, of us keeping their silence as they have kept it for 800 years. And so we come gently to the end of the road. Let the long story fold itself softly close now like a great book set down at last. The empire has risen and spread and shattered and faded. The conquerors and the conquered have all alike lain down to their rest, and the wide grasslands lie quiet beneath the slow-wheeling stars. The wind moving low and tender through the grass, as it has since before any of this began, and as it will long after we are gone. Everything you have witnessed tonight, the hungry boy, the uniting of the tribes, the thundering riders, the burning cities, the secret grave, the open roads, the slow, long twilight, all of it is at peace now, settled deep and warm into the patient earth of long ago, where nothing can disturb it and nothing need disturb you. The sky is darkening to its softest black, the last stars are dimming one by one, and the whole vast world has gone still and silent and kind. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, nothing left to fear. You are warm. You are safe. You are exactly where you belong. The grass is still. The sky is quiet. The long ride is over, and it is time now to let yourself drift all the way down into deep and peaceful sleep.